All right, everyone. So as we don't have much time in between this session and the next one, I suggest we make a start. So I'm delighted to introduce session B2 on reflections on some of the key challenges facing the European Union. So far we have talked quite a lot about teaching the European Union, but we thought that we need to link teaching and research. After all, a lot of us are engaged in research-led or research-based teaching. And in particular, yesterday we heard from people notably trying to engage students in secondary schools and so pupils in primary schools with the EU, that the EU is not always considered to be the most inspiring topic. And particularly in Ireland, it seems that there is this view that the European Union is mainly about trade and about economic issues or about the euro. So we want to actually reassure ourselves that actually the EU is a very exciting topic, and the EU is also engaged in high security and highly political matters. But also, I think it's a nice opportunity to actually reflect on some of the main issues facing the EU in the years to come, and issues that actually we will need to teach to our students, but also perhaps those of us engaged in teaching the trainers, in training the trainers. Also, those are the kind of issues that we would like them to learn about so that they can then teach the students about these important issues. So in this panel, we will have 4 presentations, so 4 presenters, and I thank them very much for joining us today, who will reflect on some of the issues facing the European Union. I think that there could have been other challenges mentioned, but those are the 4 challenges that we'll be looking at this afternoon. So we will start, first of all, with Dr. Torney from DCU, who will be talking about climate change and the role that the European Union will be playing or has been playing in that area. So he is an associate professor in the School of Law and Government at DCU, and his research focusing on climate change politics, policy, and governance. And he's co-director of the DCU Center for Climate and Society and a lead author on Ireland's first 5-year assessment report on climate change, which has been commissioned by the Environmental Protection Agency and which is due for publication in spring 2023. And he is also the program chair of the MSc in Climate Change, Policy, Media and Society of DCU. And then the second presentation will be given by Professor David Phinnemore from Queen's University, Belfast, and he will be reflecting on the issue of the EU's enlargement. So Professor Phinnemore is based in the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics at Queen's University, Belfast. His research interests include European integration and cover in particular processes of EU treaty reform and their impact on the EU, the political dynamics underpinning EU enlargement, and the EU's relations with European non-member states. And the UK's withdrawal from the EU has also led to a recent focus in his research on the negotiations of Brexit, and in particular, the thorny issue of the implications of the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland. And the third presentation will be given by Professor Oldřich Bureš, who is based at the Metropolitan University in Prague, and who will be talking about counter-terrorism. So certainly terrorism being a very important security issue that the EU has faced in the last few years. And Professor Bureš is the founding director of the Center for Security Studies and Professor of International Political Relations at Metropolitan University Prague. From 2009 until 2018, he was the head of the Department of International Relations and European Studies. His research focuses on conflict resolution and international security, with a particular emphasis on the privatization of security and counterterrorism. And finally, the fourth presentation will be given by Dr. Janine Silga, also from Dublin City University. And Dr. Silga will be talking about asylum and migration. So she is an assistant professor in European Union law at the School of Law and Government at DCU. She completed her PhD at the European University Institute in Florence, in Italy. And her doctoral research dealt with the legal dimension of the migration development nexus in the European Union policy framework. She has done substantial research on human rights in connection to both migration and asylum. And in addition to her academic activities, she has worked with several institutions, including non-governmental organizations. So I would like already to thank all our speakers, and given that there will be 4 presentations, I would like each of you to speak for up to 15 minutes, if that's okay, so that we keep a bit of time for questions and answers. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to Diarmuid, especially as I know he has to zoom off at the end of his presentation because he's teaching later today. So thank you very much for coming, nevertheless.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Sarah, and thanks, Sarah and Christian, for the invitation to join me. Yes, as Sarah said, I'm teaching at 3 o'clock, and so I won't be able to stay for the discussion, unfortunately. So apologies for that. So I have been given the topic of climate change to cover, which is like all of the topics on this panel, vast, and I could say a lot, so I'll try to limit my remarks and structure them by providing some kind of context to the climate challenge, the climate emergency, then some remarks on the EU's approach to tackling climate change, a snapshot of the present, but also placing that in some kind of historical context. I'll touch on some challenges and opportunities I see for the European Union in addressing the climate crisis, and I'll finish with some reflections on teaching climate change and the European Union. So I think the first thing to say about climate change is that so I've been working in this space about 15 years or so now, about half of that time, 8 years or so in DCU, and there has been a significant shift in public awareness, I think it's fair to say, and that has been driven partly by what we're seeing in front of our own eyes. So just to take this past year of 2022, we saw a summer of record-breaking temperatures and extreme weather events around the world. Temperature records were broken here in Ireland, in the UK, in continental Europe, and further afield. We saw extreme weather across Europe, leading to forest fires, droughts across the continent, catastrophic flooding in Pakistan, left approximately a third of the country under water. In the US, 5 1,000-year rain events were recorded in just 5 weeks over the course of the summer. China experienced the most severe heat wave in human history. New research earlier this year showed that the Arctic is warming at 4 times the speed of the rest of the planet. And I could go on with more and more examples, but I think you get the picture. And what I think is particularly important for us sitting in the European Union and in the broader European continent is that our previous understanding, perhaps our hope that climate change was something that would affect people distant from us, that is either distant in either space or time, either future generations or people in other regions of the world, but that we were to some extent insulated here in Europe. I think that that is no longer the case, and that list of weather extremes, impacts of climate change that I referred to is a stark illustration of that. So the politics of climate change is no longer the politics of intergenerational or intragenerational justice, though it still incorporates important justice dimensions. It's also about here and now, including in the European Union. Or to use the phrase of the UN Secretary General describing recent United Nations reports on climate science by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, he described those reports as a code red for humanity and an atlas of human suffering. So climate change has rightly, in my view, moved to the center of policy making, or at least towards the center of policy making in various jurisdictions around the world, has become more prominent on the global policy agenda. And we see that given concrete expression within the European Union in the form of the European Green Deal, which is this commission's one of this commission's flagship initiatives. And on one level, this is a highly surprising development, because if we look at the founding treaties of the European Union, environmental policy is mentioned nowhere. So it is something that was not part of the founding mission of the European Union, but has very much become a core part of the Union's mission. It was the European Green Deal was first introduced by the Commission. The Commission communication was published in December 2019, and it aims to completely overhaul the European economy and society over the coming decades. And this it's a transformative agenda, but it's also a radical departure from previous attempts at climate policy making within the Union, because what we saw in previous eras was an attempt to deal with climate change as a sectoral policy challenge, so as a problem of the energy system or of environmental policy. And what the European Green Deal tries to do at its core, at least the vision of the European Green Deal, is to embed climate change, biodiversity, nature, environment at the core of Union policymaking across the spectrum. And we see that in terms of its coverage. So it covers the sectors we would expect climate policy to cover, such as energy, transport, buildings, agriculture, those big emitting sectors. But it also tries to, its vision at least, is to address key cross-cutting themes such as trade, investment, the EU's relations with the rest of the world. So it is much broader in scope and ambition than any previous Union attempt at tackling the climate crisis. One of the flagship within the flagship, if you like, one of the key legislative components of the European Green Deal is what is called the Fit for 55 package. So this was a package of legislation launched in 2021, last year. And what it aims to do is to align the EU's climate and energy policies, its legislative framework, with an increased target for greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not, of course, as though the EU was starting with a blank canvas. There was an existing, quite well elaborated set of legislation around climate and energy policy, but it was aligned towards a previous decarbonisation goal. And so what the Fit for 55 package is trying to do is basically upping the level of ambition in each of those different elements of the legislative package, so that it is consistent with the Union's commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% relative to 1990 levels by 2030. And that's where the 55 comes from. So that package is making its way through the legislative process. There's a whole set of different regulations and directives making their way through the system. Some of them are under negotiation as we speak. So the devil, as they say, will be in the detail. The devil will also be in the implementation. So it is an extremely broad and wide-ranging vision, as I said, set out in the European Green Deal. The challenge will be in implementation, and in that respect, the EU is no different from many other regions of the world, and indeed many of its member states. Here in Ireland, we have been very good at setting bold policy visions for climate action. We have been less successful at following through. So it remains to be seen how successful the Union will be in achieving its decarbonisation goals for 2030. And building on that, I want to touch on some challenges and opportunities as I see them. And so the first one is that I think the first challenge is that the scale and the scope of change required to hit those decarbonisation goals, that is 55% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050. I don't think the scale and scope of change is sufficiently understood by key policy actors, by member state governments, by stakeholders, by industry, and by society at large. That scale of change requires a fundamental re-engineering of economy and society within little more than a generation. It can be done. It's certainly technically feasible. The question is whether it's politically, societally, and institutionally feasible. But there are opportunities in making that transition to build cleaner, healthier societies that are able to thrive. The second challenge that I want to identify is the challenge of competing and misaligned policy agendas. So if we think back to a decade or more ago, more like 15 years ago, in the run-up to, in the latter stages of the 2000s, climate change became a central mission or a central guiding principle of EU policy and of policy on the international agenda. And then the global financial crisis hit, and climate change completely fell off the agenda. And as the COVID pandemic hit, there was a fear, certainly among the environmental community, that we might see something similar play out again. And the evidence, the historical evidence, shows that climate change and environmental challenges tend to rise to the top of the agenda in broadly good economic times, but they get crowded out by other competing concerns. And I think what we've seen since the onset of the COVID pandemic is that climate change hasn't been crowded out, certainly not to the same extent that we saw during the global financial crisis. Similarly, with the Ukraine crisis, this year we've seen, if you like, a battle of narratives. So the narrative that now is not the time to prioritize the climate transition because we have more urgent goals and challenges in the form of the war in Ukraine and the European response to it, versus the narrative that now is precisely the time that we should be accelerating the move away from fossil fuels, because a shift away from fossil fuel energy helps us to address our climate goals and means us off gas, oil, and coal from Russia, and also from other repressive regimes. So there's definitely an opportunity there. The third challenge I want to identify relates to the global context, and most immediately challenges around US-China tensions that cast a shadow over world affairs, but including the global politics of climate change. And the broader challenge for the European Union is that in climate terms, it is a declining power. We may consider it a declining power in other respects as well, but in terms of its contribution to the problem of climate change, that is the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the global atmosphere, the EU is unambiguously a declining power because its contribution to the problem is declining. So that's a challenging landscape for the European Union to carve out its role in the world. But I think there's also an opportunity there for the EU to continue to play a distinctive role on the international stage in an area where it has a lot of symbolic power, has shown to some extent leadership on climate issues in the past. Before wrapping up, I just want to offer a couple of reflections from a teaching perspective. So I've been teaching particularly on climate change, a little bit less on the European Union, though I do cover the role of the European Union in my teaching of climate change and environmental policy. I have recently returned from a field trip to Brussels with students on our masters in climate change, where we visited the European Parliament last week at the invitation of Dublin MEP Kieran Cuff. So I'm fresh back from that experience. But I think climate change and the European Union, to some extent, share some common characteristics. They're both complex, jargon-laden topics that can be hard for the ordinary person to get their heads around. They're also both subject to misinformation. They're also both, to some extent, characterized by issues around balanced subjectivity, and I think in the climate debates, these issues have more or less been resolved, but the need to present both sides in contexts where arguably different sides of an argument don't have the same objective claims to truth. Excuse me. In my own teaching, I've tried to use active and participatory learning around simulations, role play, hands-on assessment, and so forth. Simulations involving the UN climate change negotiations, assessments where students write submissions to public consultations on climate policy, and I've found that those all a very good way of engaging students, and it might be something for further dialogue as the EU Academy project takes shape, to have a discussion around those kinds of teaching methods and techniques. And in fact, the class at 3 o'clock that I'm going on to teach is a preparatory session for a UN climate change negotiations simulation that I'm going to be doing with first-year students at the start of the next semester. So I'll leave it there. I don't think I'll be able to say much longer than my own contribution, so apologies for that. But thank you very much again for the invitation, and I hope the rest of the afternoon is, I'm sure it'll be a very interesting discussion. So I'll hand back over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. Is there any quick question? I actually have one. I was wondering, because we heard yesterday from colleagues working with students in secondary school, they were saying that in secondary schools in Ireland, they were saying that a lot of students are interested in international matters, but they don't really see the EU as being international. So they're interested in the UN, for example. So I was wondering, do your students at the beginning of your your course? Do they identify the EU as an actor, as an entity playing an important role in these matters, or is it something that actually they're merely considering individual countries and then the UN, and they don't really see the EU as actually playing an important role in that subject?
So I've never posed that question to students, but for example, in this simulation, so it's a simulation designed by a US non-profit called Climate Interactive, and I guess the UN climate change negotiations, climate regime, is one in which the EU, as EU, has for a long time played quite a prominent role, and although it's a long time ago now that the Commission, I think, requested requested from the Council the power to speak on behalf of the European Union. In practice, there's a very unified voice. The presidency and the Commission basically work together very much in tandem with each other. So I think the empirical story is that the EU does play quite a prominent role. And in the simulation, for example, the EU is one of 6 delegations. So it's a highly simplified version of the UN climate negotiations, but one of the 6 delegations is the European Union. So I've never asked them the question of how they see the EU, but they implicitly receive the message from this simulation that the EU is an important player.
All right, thank you very much. Well, we will let you go now, as give you an opportunity to catch your breath before you teach. So thank you so much for coming this afternoon. And we will now move on to the second presentation by Professor David Phinnemore from Queen's University Belfast on enlargement.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Thanks for having me along. So yeah, enormous amount one could say about enlargement, but I think I just want to say a few remarks about where we are with enlargement, and then sort of pick up on 3 or 4 points for possible further discussion later on. Thinking ahead, next year, 2023, 50 years of EU enlargement, quite an anniversary for the EU. An EU which has been transformed from the original 6, it's gone to 9, to 10, to 12, 15, 25, 27, 28, and then back down to 27. And that's probably as much as I'm going to say about Brexit. I certainly wouldn't mention the protocol. It's been a period, 50 years, during which almost every European state has applied at least once for EU membership. Most have seen their applications through. Some have not. I think when we look back at enlargement, we tend to forget that the Norwegians not necessarily seeing through to accession, to concluded accession treaties. We've had in more recently the Icelandic case, and also the Swiss have dabbled with enlargement. They've obviously not gone on to EU membership. Most other states have, or at least have got into a place where they continue to hope that they will one day join the European Union. It's a 50-year period in which we've seen quite radical transformation of the membership of the EU, and has probably led to an EU of such size and geographical scope that no one would have imagined or envisaged back in 1973. Some of us are old enough to remember 1973 just about. I don't think anybody at that particular time envisaged there being an EU of 27, 28 member states, and potentially more. And certainly during the times of the Cold War, the thought of countries of Central and Eastern Europe becoming members was very much a pipe dream of many. Okay. Importantly today, so 2022 going into 2023, we have an EU that continues to attract states wanting to join. A year ago, we were very much focused on the countries of the Western Balkans, and some of us had still got memories of Turkey being formally part of the process, even though it's effectively its candidacy was on hold. 2022 has been interesting, obviously, because we've now got Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova joining the ranks of applicants, and 2 of them being upgraded to candidates. And the understanding is that we could be getting another applicant later this week with a Kosovan application coming through. At one level, 2022 has given a little bit more impetus to enlargement. It's got us thinking about enlargement a little bit more. and about how the EU might eventually actually deliver on the commitments it's made to a series of states, many of which have now been waiting longer than any other member state, any other states to accede to the European Union. It raises questions which I think have long been left unanswered for the last decade as to whether the EU will actually enlarge further. Just as we've got the 50th anniversary coming up of the EU's first enlargement, next year will also be the 10th anniversary of the last enlargement. We've gone through one of the most barren periods in the history of the EU in terms of enlargement. Plenty of commitment, plenty of negotiation, plenty of process, but no actual enlargement. And I think for those of us who've been around a fair bit of time on this, we continue to ask ourselves, will we see a further enlargement of the European Union? And I think there's a key question there which the EU has to come to at some point, because it's tattered credibility in terms of enlargement. If it's going to be restored, saved, if some credibility is going to be given to the commitments it's made to the likes of Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, it really does need to get serious about delivering on enlargement. Okay, I can see John nodding his head. We may get to some discussion of this towards the end. Okay, so four reflections beyond those I just offered there. But first is, okay, there is definitely an appetite for enlargement. The demand is there. Even though we've not had an enlargement for 10 years, we've got Serbia and Montenegro making progress in negotiations. We've got Albania and North Macedonia last beginning negotiations. We've got Bosnia-Herzegovina there in the mix. We've got Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia are now hoping to get negotiations at some point in the future. And as I mentioned, we've got Kosovo as well. The demand side remains strong. But the question, which I think has been bedeviling enlargement for quite some time now, is where's the supply side? What's happening on that supply side? Yes, candidate status is being granted. Yes, negotiations are opening, but at an extremely slow rate, an unprecedentedly slow rate in many respects. And even though the EU's response to the applications to Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia was very swift indeed, unprecedentedly swift, I think it's fair to say, we run the significant risk, I think, as we get to the end of 2022, that any enthusiasm that those applications may have rekindled for enlargement begins to wane. And I think a key challenge for the EU is actually sustaining any rekindling of enthusiasm for enlargement, which 2022 brought about. Okay, so there's a key challenge there for, I think, the EU to work out how it's going to respond to this continued demand for accession. Second set of observations concerns more about the process. Why is it the case that we've not necessarily had enlargement? If we look at the process, yes, the EU, since Eastern Enlargement in 2004, the negotiation of that, has developed a pretty sophisticated, some might say overly developed too bureaucratic process for admitting states. I don't think we've ever been a point in the EU where states coming into the EU have not had clearer guidance on what is actually required to join. It's extensive guidance, and arguably too extensive for many of those states to actually meet all the criteria before they come in, particularly at a time when the criteria, although they have not necessarily evolved too much, have been increasingly applied in a stricter manner than has previously been the case, such that the threshold for joining the EU has probably never been higher than it is today. The concern I'd have here is that the process, while necessarily technocratic and bureaucratic, has possibly become overly technocratic and bureaucratic in the sense that the politics of enlargement has been withdrawn. That the process of enlargement is seen very much as a process of hurdles to overcome, hoops to go through, and only when those hurdles and hoops have been overcome, gone through, can a state actually join. The EU seems to have lost the capacity to take a strategic decision on whether to admit states. Now, for those of us old enough to remember the 2004 enlargement, the rhetoric around that enlargement was pretty impressive, about a return to Europe, about a unique opportunity, about using this as a process as a means to try and promote various principles, particularly around rights, particularly around the principles of democracy and the market economy. Okay, we can look back from where we are today and look at the cases of Hungary and Poland and say, okay, well, the EU in some respects has been an abject failure in actually securing the progress of these states to become functioning democracies. But at least back in 2003, 2004, we had a narrative there, which was encouraging, which is just a political dimension to the process, which seems to now be almost absent. Okay. That said, third point, as any follower of EU enlargement will be aware, equally, the process has probably become too politicized in the sense that national politics has taken over. And we have what I would say is a rather, in some respects, poor situation where we have, in various instances, single states using national vetoes to block progress block the progress of states towards accession. A process which most other member states seem perfectly happy to hide behind, so that they don't have to take on the challenges of admitting new states. This is a worrying development because historically, I think prior to, I think it was Croatia's accession, member states obviously had their interest in enlargement. They wanted to defend those, but didn't necessarily use them in the process to block states coming in. And we've seen the last decade, a whole series of examples where, particularly Cyprus, then Greece, then Bulgaria, have used the national veto to block, unnecessarily in many respects, the progress of states towards accession, and basically kept the other member states from delivering on the shared commitment towards making the progress of these states towards accession real. Key challenge for the EU is how do you actually overcome that situation? I think it becomes a more pressing challenge because we're about to have, according to press reports, this cost of an application coming through. It'd be very interesting to see how the council manages to respond to that, particularly when 5 states within the council continue to not recognise Kosovo. Okay. So I think there's some interesting times to come there, but there's a big issue there about the EU overcoming individual member states blocking enlargement when there's been a shared commitment to admit these, or to at least facilitate the accession of these countries. Okay, but my final point comes down to the EU thinking a little bit more strategically about how it manages enlargement. And 2 things to think about through here is, how does it actually facilitate the progress of states from candidacy to membership? Is there a need, as I think the likes of SEPs have indicated, to reconceptualize membership in a way which creates some intermediate steps, which allows these states that are seeking membership to gain some sort of staged accession towards the EU, okay, such that they actually, you can see substantive reward for these states, which may not be the same as full membership that we associate with the likes of the core within the European Union, but nevertheless begins to bring these states into the institutions of the EU and remove that pretty crude binary of in or out in terms of participation in the institutions. We've been here before, and the debate has never led anywhere. But given the number of states that are on the knocking at the door of the EU, and the geostrategic importance of those for the EU now, then arguably there's a need to reconsider that. But another dimension is the ability of the EU member states to actually assume domestic leadership of enlargement. What seems to have been totally absent from the enlargement debate over the last 15, 20 years has been domestic ownership of what's collectively agreed at the European Union level. We have member state governments often failing to lead in shaping domestic political or informing domestic political debate about the value of enlargement, about the value for these states seeking to come in of progress towards actual accession. There's been a tendency to allow domestic concerns, some of which are legitimate, to take a dominant position within domestic political debate about enlargement, such that the political leadership finds itself constrained to actually advocate for further enlargement at the European Union level. And I think we need to see that being redressed. I think that requires probably some shared narrative being developed at the EU level, which is then translated back into domestic political debate within those states. I'd go back here once again to 2003, where the narrative around the Eastern enlargement was a case of historic opportunity, geostrategic need, and developing a rights-based agenda, using that as a justification to facilitate further enlargement of the European Union. The language we saw back then, particularly around sort of the Dublin summit, seems to be totally absent from EU enlargement today. Okay, so challenges there. I suppose my concern is that although there are lots of challenges here, there may not be the space on the EU's policy agenda to necessarily think all these issues through and draw some meaningful conclusions such that some impetus can be given to enlargement, and that we run the risk of simply slipping back into this current approach, or maintaining this current approach, which basically just sees the EU sort of muddling through on enlargement, stuck in a technocratic process, and one which is not going to necessarily lead particularly quickly to any of these countries actually joining the European Union. And it could be a further 10 years before we see any meaningful enlargement of the EU again.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. That was extremely interesting. I think you have certainly given us a lot to think about there. I guess we will take questions. Diana just took the questions for Diarmuid earlier because you had to dash off, but we will hear first all the presentations. So I would like now to move on to Oldřich at Metropolitan University Prague, who's going to talk about counter-terrorism. Oldřich, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everybody, and greetings from freezing Prague. It's a pleasure to be here, at least online with you, and thank you, Sarah, for the invitation. I'm a PowerPoint person, so I have prepared a PowerPoint, so I hope I can share the screen because I also have some data that I would like to show. So let me try if it works. So please let me know whether you can see my screen.
Yes, if you could perhaps, yeah, perfect, thank you.
Perfect. So in my presentation, I want to first give you a bit of an overview what kind of a threat terrorism has been for the EU and why the EU has actually developed the counter-terrorism policy. This is both about the number of terrorist events, but also how these are perceived, and I will be trying to show that they are perceived quite differently across the European Union. This has some pretty important implications for the EU efforts to fight terrorism. And then after this sort of empirical introduction, I will delve into what actually the EU has done and what I see as the key problems and challenges in what the EU has been doing in the fight against terrorism. So if you look, or if you start with the data, this is the most recent data compiled and published annually by Europol, the EU Police Cooperation Agency, the so-called Trends and Situation Report. And if you look at the data, it's actually, if you want, a pretty positive picture, especially if you look at the smaller circles, which represent the number of attacks committed in Europe, in EU member states recently. You can see that the numbers have been going down. In 2021, only 15 terrorist attacks have been perpetrated on the territory of the EU. So this is substantially down from what we have seen in the past. This is what I try to compile from these reports that have been published since 2006. You can see that the situation has changed quite dramatically, at least when it comes to the number of attacks since 2017. But Europe has seen quite bad years, if you want, prior to that, in terms of the number of attacks. If I return to the previous slide, what the data also shows is that while there haven't been that many attacks, a substantial number of people still have been arrested on various terrorism charges. This is especially the case for jihadi or Islamist terrorism, but you can also see right-wing terrorism being on the second place with what has just happened in Germany. I think confirms that many would argue this is the rising threat that we are seeing in Europe and potentially elsewhere. But we also still see substantial numbers of people arrested for left-wing and ethno-separatist terrorism. If you look a bit more historically on the data, much of terrorism in Europe has been ethno-separatist, but since 9/11, at least in terms of the number of people killed, the dominant attention paid in counterterrorism has been to Islamist terrorism, which in this slide is the green line that has been there. The blue line is precisely the ethno-separatist terrorist attacks. Just to put it in context, I want to highlight the origins of the EU's response to terrorism date back already to the 1970s. This also has an empirical base, while many analysts have argued that since the 9/11 attacks on the US, we have faced an unprecedented terrorist threat. Many countries, and especially Western Europe, have seen worse or similar in the 1970s and in the 1980s, precisely because of the large-scale campaigns of the ethno-separatist and left-wing primarily terrorist groups, so DTAs, RAs, etc. So this is just to keep it in perspective, but also explain why the EU has actually developed some kind of cooperation in the fight against terrorism, even though, of course, the initial treaties have said nothing about terrorism being a challenge that the EU should address. The final data that I want to show is an adjusted version, which just highlights why, at least since 9/11, much of the emphasis has been on these Islamist terrorist attacks. Numerically, in terms of the number of attacks executed, this has not been the dominant type of terrorism in Europe. But the red columns indicate the number of people being killed, which is sort of the debate about new terrorism for the sake of terrorism and killing lots of people for no obvious reasons other than killing them, which was at least part of the explanation why the counterterrorism policy after 9/11, even in Europe, has focused primarily on the threat of Islamist terrorism. So this is the threat itself. Another question is, of course, how it's perceived by citizens of EU member states. Here, again, potentially good news. This is the most recent Eurobarometer. EU citizens are asked every half a year about the two most important issues, both at the EU level and at the national level. If you are searching for terrorism here, it's not there. So in the most recent data, other pressing issues have taken over terrorism. If you look at the more detailed statistics, you can find terrorism at the bottom of the top 10 concerns. And with the decreasing, let's say, percentage of salience, both this is the EU level, this is then at the national level, where it's even lower than at the EU level. But historically speaking, this hasn't always been the case. Again, if you look at some longer time periods, you could see that, for example, most recently, after the Paris and Brussels terrorist attacks, terrorism has been one of the top, if not the top concern for EU citizens. Also worth noting, and this is another complication, there are substantial differences, both when it comes to the salience of terrorism and other issues across the EU member states. So to develop a coherent response is always a challenge because different countries perceive the threat of terrorism very differently, both at the political level and in terms of public opinion, which does matter when it comes to the design of counterterrorism policies in democratic countries. So why these differences persist, and this is another challenge when it comes to developing an EU level supranational, if you want, counterterrorism policy. The threat is not evenly distributed. Here again, from the TSET report, you can see the number of attacks and arrests plotted on the map of Europe. Basically, with a bit of oversimplification, the more east you go, or potentially also a bit more north you go, the less terrorism you have seen. So again, different countries, because of this, will have somewhat different interests in fighting terrorism as a key policy issue. Also, in terms of, if you want, the problem itself or the debate about radicalization, which you can see as a proxy about how many citizens potentially are a threat in different member states, the numbers on foreign fighters, people who have left to fight in Syria and Iraq at the height of the Islamic State. You can again see a very unequal distribution of these arguably most hardened radicals slash foreign terrorist fighters across the EU. So these have been some of the complications. Now, at least briefly, what the EU has done. As I already mentioned, the origins can be traced to the 1970s. This was a very informal intergovernmental framework, sharing information, trying to ease the rules on extradition, political cooperation vis-a-vis terrorists, targeting Europe from outside, especially from the Middle East, the Munich Olympic Games attacks, for example, in 1972 as being the top of the iceberg there. But it can be argued that genuinely the EU has really developed what could be called a response or policy only after the 9/11 attacks on the US. And basically ever since, it has been, I would say, emphasis on three potential areas: law enforcement cooperation, slash intelligence cooperation, judicial cooperation, and then most recently an addition to what could be called an external dimension, reflecting that much of what is going on outside of EU borders may actually substantially impact the terrorist threat inside the EU. We have, of course, seen major impact, especially after the large-scale terrorist attacks in Europe. So Madrid, London, more recently Paris and Brussels, to make sure everything works. After Madrid, the EU got the position of the EU Counter-terrorism coordinator. We also have the EU Counter-terrorism strategy. I don't have the time to go into detail, but basically 4 pillars which would provide a comprehensive approach to the fight against terrorism, both when it comes to preventing future terrorist attacks and responding to those that have actually taken place. There has been one major update recently. The Pursue pillar has been replaced by Anticipate. Many analysts would argue this is going basically even before prevention, trying to stop the terrorists before they even think about committing terrorism, using big data, artificial intelligence. Again, we'd be happy to discuss more in the Q&A session. In terms of some of the challenges that I would see of responding to terrorism at the EU level, the first one I already demonstrated in the data, so the continuing differences in the salience of the threat and the perceptions of the terrorist threat across the EU. This then leads to the second point, that is that there is not always a political consensus that the EU is the best level to go forward with the fight against terrorism. Ultimately, the perception in many member states is that it's still a primarily national security issue, and what exactly should be the EU role, which is always supporting one, coordinating one, is, if you want, up to the debate. There has been also a problem that while many things have been agreed at the EU level, especially after the major terrorist attacks, this is one visualization of that. Lots of different strategies, new bodies, structures, and legal measures agreed, especially again after the major terrorist attack. Especially you can see here the jumps after 2015 and 2016 attacks in France and Belgium. Another question is how much of that is actually used and implemented, and there has been some discussion that not always that much. This is from a report published in 2017 by the Hague Counter-terrorism Center and PricewaterhouseCoopers, and you can see that relatively little attention is paid to what has been actually used and how measures that have been already agreed have been implemented at the EU level. Yet, after each major terrorist attack, you have the suggestion that perhaps more needs to be done at the EU level. Too many counterterrorism bodies, which is related, perhaps another visualization. If you cannot make sense of this within the 15 seconds that I will keep it on the slide, this is precisely the point that I want to illustrate, that perhaps it's too complex even for the experts to follow this in terms of who is in charge of what, and perhaps then also just connecting the dots at the EU level with all these bodies, committees, working groups may be a challenge of its own. The next challenge that I've seen, and this is not unique to the EU, again, just one slide to illustrate that with a bit of a cartoonish approach, is the security versus justice / liberty debates, which are always pertinent in all security issues, but perhaps in counterterrorism, given the impact that many of these measures may have or had on liberties of EU citizens, there has been quite a bit of controversy from EU measures to fight terrorist financing to the measures that you have seen at the airports or airport security, to which this cartoon also refers, with the so-called slippery slope argument that some of them may be going so far that the best would be if we didn't travel at all, which would of course make us all very secure, but this is probably not where we want our societies to actually go. I would also, to conclude, identify a few new challenges regarding the foreign fighters that I briefly alluded to. Many of them have tried to return to Europe or potentially move to other theaters or to continue fighting either for the Islamic States or other outfits. The big question is, what can we do about them? Big debate whether we should take them back, and if so, how can we prosecute them, or potentially the other option, reintegrate them into our societies. So if you want the debate between the so-called soft and hard approaches, this slide is a bit, again, over simplifying the approaches, but either surveil them, put them all in jail, or at least monitor them, or somehow try to reintegrate them into the societies. Given the numbers, probably a combination is necessary, but it has been very challenging. And finally, the last point, also referring to the numbers that I have already shown you, given the decrease of the number of terrorist attacks, and if you want the higher importance of many other pressing issues, some of which we are also discussing in this panel, from enlargement, climate change, the war in Ukraine, it seems that terrorism is, if you want, slipping down from the radar of both policymakers and the citizens of the EU. We have seen this before. Usually this changes after the next major terrorist attack. But in between, if you want, the resources and the attention both at the national and the EU level drop quite significantly, which then creates to this counterterrorism cycle, which is not always conducive to the fight against terrorism in the medium to the long run. So I see I'm over time, so I will leave it here, but happy to take any questions later on.
Thank you very much, Olda. And now I would like to hand over to our last speaker on this panel, Janine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much again, Sarah and Christian, for invitation to participate in the launch of the EU Academy. I will actually try to share my screen. I have a couple of slides, so don't worry, just 3 of them should be. So just that you can follow basically the outline of my presentation. So actually, in your presentation of the EU Academy, which was part of your official invitation, there was something that particularly struck me, because you mentioned the need to better educate on the EU through not only promoting a genuinely informed but also critical debate on the EU without resorting to populist messages that are grounded in misinformation and alternative facts, and I would even call them fake news very often. So given the highly politicized nature of the EU migration policy, broadly speaking, I do believe, just as you probably, that this field of knowledge is particularly exposed to such misinformation and a general misunderstanding in general. So I am delighted to present on this topic, which has been one of the key challenges of the EU on the EU agenda for more or less a bit less than 2 decades now, if not more. So just to give to all of you a couple of examples of what Alberto Horst Neidhardt and Paul Butcher, who are both policy analysts at the European Policy Center, have called the disinformation on migration. I would like to mention the recent portrayal, for instance, of Ukrainian refugees in the Czech Republic and also in Romania as being wealthy and yet receiving significant social and financial support, while needy locals were left without help. These same authors also report on how how in Poland, Ukrainians have also been falsely accused of committing violent crimes against local residents. And some of these accusations actually echo the earlier portrayals of refugees during the 2015-2016 crisis. Refugee crisis, and for instance, there was this portrayal of refugees being wealthy, so wealthy that they had to contribute to the expenses of their own reception. For instance, in Denmark, so we've all heard about the so-called jewelry law, and in the same context, some also claimed that Muslims were impossible to integrate as a way to oppose to the relocation scheme of the EU. Again, more recently, the fear of invasion resurfaced in the EU after the Taliban took over in Afghanistan in August 2021. And this was actually waged, especially by right-wing activists, and not only by them, unfortunately, in the same way as, for instance, in France, we've heard a lot about this theory, or rather this myth of the great replacement, whereby there would be a conspiracy, global conspiracy, to replace white Europeans with foreigners. So I could go on like this, of course, but these few examples already give us a good overall sense of the highly political sensitivity, the highly political nature of migration. And this also reflects the constant, or the impression that the EU migration policy is in a constant state of crisis, almost its birth in the early 1990s. So more importantly for us today, these examples highlight the need now more than ever, in my view, for adequate communication, and especially for adequate education on issues connected to migration. So it is in this context that I will now focus on some of the main challenges of the EU migration and asylum policy within the next 10 minutes or so. So to do that, I will essentially adopt my own perspective, and I will rely on my own experience as a researcher, but especially today as a teacher of EU and EU migration law and policy. So when I started teaching EU migration law and policy, I could feel that students initially had great expectations about the lectures, and I could feel that they were picturing in their minds having constantly heated debates about migration in a similar way to what the media are usually conveying on this topic. So when I started telling them about the institutional dimension of the policy, or about the case law of the European Court, I could see clearly how their initial very high level of interest and excitement was slowly fading away. So actually my teaching, to give you a bit more detail about that, really started a couple of years after the peak of the migration crisis, which reached its climax more or less between, I would say, 2015 and 2016. And I think that to be given the opportunity to teach in the aftermath of the crisis was very beneficial, both to my students and to myself, because it allowed us really to look into these issues with a more distant look. So just before going on with my intervention, as you've probably understood, I have to confess that as a law teacher, the focus of my teaching on migration has not been mainly on the political dimension of the matter, at least strictly speaking, because I would argue, and probably you would agree with me, that when teaching about EU law in general and about EU migration law in particular, the entanglement between the political and the legal runs deep. So by making my lectures sound duller, sound a bit more boring, so the legal translation for that, by making them more technical from a legal perspective, I also actually wanted my students to think critically about the existence and about the legitimacy of this entanglement between the political and the legal in the field of the EU migration law and policy. And in doing so, my main objective was to give them an alternative way to understand migration in the EU context, so that they could in turn, on their own, develop their own understanding that would be informed by different facts from what they could usually find in mainstream journal articles. So being duller, at least at first sight, was also a way for me to make sure that when a debate would take place, because it always did, it would be on healthier grounds than for the examples that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentations. And last, the reason why I also wanted to not to be boring, but to be more technical, was to level the playing field, because because I really felt that I had to shield my students or to protect them to some extent from my own personal and political opinions and my own biases, which I think are unavoidable, especially on these topics. So I do not know if I was successful, but I will now give you a sample of the way in which I have approached some of the key challenges of the EU migration policy in my teaching. So when I started teaching, and even before that, I realized very fast that it was not always clear. So I think that some of the speakers also mentioned that it was not always clear who is actually making decisions on the EU migration policy. So in other words, who is in the driving seat. So from the media perspective, it very often looks as if the EU is either doing too much, so it exceeds its actual competences in this field, or it looks as if it is not doing enough, so it does not give sense to its commitment to the respect of human rights, and in particular to the right of asylum. So in this sense, the debate on what the EU is doing when it comes to the EU migration policy tends to be heavily polarized. So obviously, when teaching about the EU migration policy, my idea was not to present the EU either as being the good or the bad guy of the situation, but it was rather usually to approach the question was actually by giving an answer consisting in one sentence, which students usually do not like. That is, it depends. It depends on the situation. So to be more precise, there are two main points which I wanted to clarify with them, two traditional points. So first, what the EU can actually do and what it cannot do. And second, how come the EU can actually do what it can do, what it does. And I usually start when answering the second question, is it would basically show the evolution of the migration policy from its very early and purely intergovernmental days to what we currently know as the EU migration policy as a proper field of EU integration, at least to a large extent, I would argue, compared to the beginning at least. So my main objective in doing that is to show that the EU migration policy arose from the will of the member states. I'm not against it, as it is sometimes portrayed nowadays. And another objective in this sense is also for students to understand how the EU migration policy, in its early days at least, has been instrumental for the member states to build an area of internal free movement. So the early cooperation between the member states on migration did not, as a consequence, or mostly, stem from the intentions of the EU institutions. And this is usually at this stage that I mentioned the 1985 Schengen Agreement and its legacy in the current EU treaties as the best illustration to make students understand about the current reach, and the legacy of intergovernmentalism for the EU migration policy. And the final objective of this presentation is that want students to understand that unlike what may be said about the EU migration policy, the EU member states also have to comply with what they have actually committed to, as any responsible international actor should do. And for this reason, I explained to them how some member states, former and current member state, that is, the UK for former member state, Denmark and Ireland, had decided that their level of cooperation with the other member states would be less intense than for the other member states in this field. So now coming to the second question on clarifying this institutional picture, so what the EU can actually do and what it cannot do. The second question relates to the competencies of the EU in the field of migration and asylum. And it is usually at this stage that in a desperate attempt to keep my students' attention, to keep or to even capture it, because if I've lost it before, I will have to capture it at this stage, I explain to them that looking at the EU competences as they are rather than as they are usually presented is really the best way to dispel some of the most prevalent myths about the role of the EU on migration. And so not only in terms of what the EU can or cannot do, but also, and perhaps more importantly, in terms of what the EU should or could do or do better. So some of the most interesting myths which students have been I've brought to my attention, so they've been interested to learn about, concern, for instance, the limited competence of the EU when it comes to the regulation of labor immigration, and in particular when it comes to the admission of workers from non-EU or third countries. And I've noticed that students are also particularly interested to learn about the fact that the EU cannot actually harmonize the integration policies of the member states, so it cannot go as deep as it is sometimes portrayed in the media. And this also gives us a good opportunity at this stage to clarify a few concepts, and for example, to understand that the so-called short-term Schengen visas do not actually allow third country nationals to settle in the EU, but rather that it is only for the member states themselves to decide on which criteria they choose for the long-term admission of third country nationals, of foreigners, people who are non-nationals from the EU. And another example is how the EU competence in the field of asylum has to be exercised actually in compliance with international requirements. And this includes, very importantly, the cornerstone principle of non-refoulement, by which all the EU member states have decided to abide willingly. And this explains why, as a matter of principle, people who are in need of protection are also entitled to asylum, and the member states are very well aware of that. So, stemming from this question, I now move to the second question about who are the migrants in the EU legal space. So in the aftermath of the 2015-2016 crisis, the label of the migrants has appeared as a new way to categorize people, mostly coming from non-European countries. And while the word migrants is perfectly clear and perfectly correct from the descriptive point of view, it is also usually loaded somehow with the impression that these people who are moving in high numbers should probably not be here. And this is the reason why this step is of being more precise about who the migrants actually are is so important. And although it is not my field of expertise at all, I'm always very happy to give a few statistical data to my students at this stage. For example, this helps them to gain perspective on the 2015-2016 refugee crisis, in which there were around, in the course of 2 years, around 2 million people who came, which is quite a low figure compared to the EU population and also compared to the number of refugees who are hosted in other parts of the world. And this is also where it becomes so important to actually unpack this issue of the legal categorizations of migrants, which is often taken for granted. And in doing so, I have two main objectives. So first, to present the current state of the immigration policy as part of a wider geographical and also perhaps more importantly, as part of a wider historical background. So they are usually surprised to learn that our current migration regime, the current immigration regime that exists globally only comes or only originates from the end of the 19th century. So it's always a surprise for them. And my other objective is how a deeper understanding of who the migrants are also leads students to understand that they are also human. So it's a way to rehumanize the migrants in the eyes of a student, and to understand how legal statuses, legal categories actually function as legal fictions for the purpose of defining the reality of some people. So the finding that as human beings, migrants also have rights is naturally a surprise for students. But what surprises them, however, is how migrants do not actually have as many rights as it appears to be, or as they are presented to have. And in particular, what surprises them is how the protection of their rights can be sometimes very unpredictable. And this allows us to explore then the darker side, what I've called the darker side of the EU migration law, by looking at the case law, especially of the two European courts, namely the European Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Justice of the EU, which can be regarded as the arbitrators of migration law and policy in the European legal space. So at this stage, I really want usually students to think beyond the most celebrated cases of the courts, such as the MSS ruling, for instance, on Dublin, or the Ruiz-Zambrano case, for example. And this allows me to now come to the final part of my presentation with a few concluding observations on how the arbitrators of the EU migration legal space are wise or to which extent they are or not wise enough. And this step is crucial. I found that this step is actually crucial, because this is where students, for instance, understand, discover sometimes how the European Court of Human Rights uses to this day almost the same formulation of the principle of immigration control as a legitimate objective of states' public policy, and as it was, so the same formulation as this formulation that was first articulated by the US Supreme Court in the so-called Chinese exclusion cases, which had clearly racist undertones. So here there is one sample of these Chinese exclusion cases. So it is the Nishimura IQ case, which is not actually about a Chinese national, it was about a Japanese national, but this is one of the best examples of the formulation of this principle of immigration control. And here we have almost the same formulation used by the European Court of Human Rights to justify limitations to family reunification. So just to cite a couple more of examples as a way to really close my presentations now. I've also seen with students how the Court of Justice, for instance, as the EU now has accepted that Schengen visas cannot be humanitarian visas as a way to, for the purpose of ensuring safe access for asylum seekers to the EU. And students also discover very often with disappointment how the Court of Justice has actually sanctioned, has actually protected, blessed deals such as the EU-Turkey deals that basically lead to trading people. So this is, with these very short and brief remarks, I will now close my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that I will have a very fruitful discussion for the time that remains. Thank you very much. Sorry, Sarah, I cannot hear you. I think you're muted.
Thank you very much, Janine. I know it's not easy to cover so much ground in so little time, but all of our speakers have managed to do just that and have given us a lot to think about. So are there any questions for our speakers? So I saw earlier that there was a question in the chat box, and that's perhaps for David, about EU-Russia relations. So how do you see enlargement and the impact that it may have on EU-Russia relations?
I think we've always, I think just looking back to this last year, the EU's response to the situation in Ukraine brought us back to a question which we were asking a lot in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Okay, well, what is it that drives the EU in terms of enlargement? Is it driven by sort of more rational cost-benefit analysis and based around geostrategic interests? To what extent is it driven by normative considerations and the sense of, okay, well, the enlargement is about sort of the self-definition of the EU? And I think it was interesting to see how the EU did respond, which was prioritizing the independence of Ukraine, the Ukrainian commitment to democracy and to the various values which the EU at least formally subscribes to. And so my expectation would be that if the EU follows through on this, I think the expectation is that it should and will, then, okay, it's mindful of the Russian objections, but it's got to be sure, it's got to be true to its own values, and accepting that if any state wants to subscribe to those and join the EU on the basis that it accepts those, then it's got to support that process. We'll see how this plays out in due course, but I think initially I'm fairly optimistic on this, but we'll have to see. I think going back to Paul's other question about sort of the EU admitting states possibly to underpin democracy, and possibly should have sort of thought again about it, and should there be an expelling mechanism? I think the issue more is about, okay, well, the EU is probably naive when it put in various states, assuming that, okay, this process of democratization was unidirectional. There would not be backsliding. And then it was found what because it had not got the mechanisms in place to actually manage that process. It began to develop in the context of the Bulgarian and Romanian accession. I think what the more recent developments have highlighted in terms of the EU trying to manage the Hungarian position in particular is that it lacks the internal mechanisms and the willingness to necessarily use them to try and actually redress the behaviour or the concerns about the behaviour of existing member states. That's where the emphasis, I think needs to be. The problem, though, you've got there is you're going to be changing those mechanisms. You need unanimity, and we come back to the big problem of EU treaty reform here.
Very much, John. You wanted to comment?
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, David. I agree with so much of what you said about enlargement. I would suggest, though, that I'm more pessimistic than you are, if that's possible, for a whole variety of reasons. You may have seen that, for example, last week, the applications by Bulgaria and Romania to join Schengen were refused on the basis of the objections of a number of member states. Austria, for example, objected to Romania. And this is despite the fact that, according to the Commission's own criteria, these two states manifestly now fulfill those criteria. So there is really no basis to the objections that are being made. And it's consistent with what David talked about, the Bulgarian objection to North Macedonia and others. So I'm very pessimistic. I think the mood of enlargement fatigue is now deepened to such a point where it's almost a permanent feature of the system, despite what you might argue was something of a fillip that was provided by Ukraine and everything that happened in the earlier part of the year. But my question to David is about Macron's European political community as a kind of halfway house, as it were, to membership. I am deeply skeptical about it. I don't think the proposal is a serious one. I think it's designed to actually ensure that the Western Balkan states can never become members of the European Union. However, that's just my view. I wonder what David's view of the European political community is, and also whether the incoming Swedish presidency might have a positive impact on the enlargement process in general, because Swedish presidencies in the past have tended to be ones that encouraged enlargement, encouraged the growth of democracy, the rule of law, and so forth. So just those two things, European political community and the Swedish presidency. Thanks.
David?
Thanks, John. I'd be skeptical about Macron's EPC initiative. One, because it still remains very, very much underdeveloped, and you must ask yourself, okay, who's it actually aimed at? Because it seems to be facilitating, at one level, useful engagement with a variety of different non-member states, and it's at least providing a forum of sorts in which you can bring those together. But as soon as it becomes institutionalized, then I think, yes, you do run this definite risk of it becoming an alternative to EU membership, where those who are skeptical about further enlargements can point to it being a sort of a useful sort of holding point for states. You're not ruling out the possibility of them becoming members, but de facto it becomes that sort of holding zone. I think, yes, I can remember previous Swedish presidencies being actually quite instrumental in shifting narratives around enlargement, and I think we do when we see the Finns, the Swedes coming through, the Danes and others being slightly more, one might say, progressive in terms of wanting to facilitate further enlargement, and certainly sort of counter some of the more sceptical narratives that you tend to find within Austria and also France. This comes back to a question which I did not address. Well, who's in the driving seat in all this? And I think this is one of the big problems with enlargement. We've not got the champions around, which we've had in the past. And I think that's not just within the member states, it's also within the Commission. because I would look back to the sort of 2004 enlargement, and a lot of the dynamics in the 5 years prior to that as seeing sort of the Prodi Commission as being instrumental there. I think this is then we then come back to the question of who is the current enlargement commissioner? And I think we only need to look at some of the questions being raised about that commissioner to understand why there's not necessarily the momentum being given to enlargement that you might necessarily think there should be.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. We have our next panel of the day awaiting, and I know that Christian will not be happy if I don't promptly hand over to him for the last panel that he will be sharing. But thank you so much for the presentations and the questions. I think that, you know, when we heard from colleagues trying to engage with teachers in schools yesterday, they said one of the issues is the complexity of the EU, and I think that this panel has certainly confirmed that. I think in all policy areas, it wasn't entirely clear actually who is in the driving seat. So I guess that we have that confirmed, but we certainly have a lot to think about, and the confirmation that there is indeed a lot to keep researching in the years to come. So thank you so much to our four speakers and also to the audience for the interesting questions. So thank you so much. And at this point, I would like to hand over to Christian for the next session on Ireland and the UK after Brexit.
Right, thank you. Thank you so much for the previous panel. I think it's been a great pleasure. So thank you also from me. I really appreciated all the presentations. So now we have the last panel of the day, the last panel, in fact, of this particular workshop. This is on Ireland and the UK after Brexit. I'll just tell you first, we have Dr. Kathryn Simpson from Keele University, who will present on Ireland and the European Union, nationalism and internationalism. Then we have Mr. Alexander Conway from the Institute of International and European Affairs on Ireland's place in a post-Brexit EU. And then finally, we have our own Dr. Ian Cooper from DCU on Ireland and the UK after Brexit. But before I hand over, let me just introduce our speakers very, very briefly. So, yeah, this is when the things were not open yet. So let me start with Dr. Kathryn Simpson. She's an expert in comparative European politics, Brexit, political behavior, and political and public opinion. Her research covers the link between public attitudes to inequality and to the EU in the context of economic crisis. She's also the elected secretary and trustee of the Academic Association for Contemporary European Studies, UASIS, in the United Kingdom, and a series editor of the European Politics series published by Manchester University Press. Dr. Simpson is also a regular media commentator on European, British, and Irish politics, featuring on a range of local, national, and international media. She is a lead Brexit commentator for BBC Breakfast, featuring on the program on a regular basis. She's also a regular presenter's friend on BBC 5 Live Question Time Extra Time program. Then the presentation will be followed by Mr. Alexander Conway, who is a researcher for the Global Euro Project at the Institute for International and European Affairs. Prior to joining the Institute, he was an attaché at the permanent representation of Ireland to the OECD and UNESCO in Paris. He recently completed an MA in European Political and Governance Studies from from the College of Europe in Bruges, and also holds an MPhil in Geographical Research from Cambridge University and a BA in Political Science and Geography from Trinity College, Dublin. And then finally, our own Dr. Ian Cooper. He's a research fellow at the Brexit Institute here at Dublin City University. He holds a PhD in political science from Yale University and has previously held several academic positions in the UK, Norway, and Canada. And most recently, he was a Jean Monnet Fellow at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. His research addresses various questions of democracy and constitutionalism in the European Union, with a particular focus on the role of parliaments. His most recent work has appeared in a variety of different journals, notably also the Journal of European Public Policy, Comparative European Politics, and Parliamentary Affairs. So thank you all very, very much for being here with us today. And without further ado, I hand over to the first presentation. Kathryn, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you can all hear me okay. I've got a little presentation, so I'm just going to pull this up and share screens and all the rest of it before. Let me just see, hang on. Let me share screen. We'll go with that one instead, and I'll put my presentation over there. Okay. Hope you can all see that okay. Yeah. And we'll go from the beginning. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be with you today online. I hope to join you all in DCU in the very near future. I think this is a really fantastic project and it's wonderful to see it being funded. So congratulations to Christian and to Sarah on this. I'm going to talk about this this concept and thesis of nationalism and internationalism and how this is fed into Ireland's relationship with the European Union over the course of the last, I say, 50 years of membership. And really, this is based on a book. I currently, sorry, excuse me, just, yes, thank you. A book that I have recently published with my co-author, who is Michael Holmes, who's based at the University Catholique in Lille. Yeah, I think people can't see my screen. I can send the slides around. I think I've got too many screens open, but let me have another go. Let me, can people see that now? Or not?
Can't see it at the moment. No.
No, you can't see it. Let me just one participant share screen. I've only got host sharing options. It's okay. I can leave it. I can speak without it. It's okay. So what I really want to do, so this is based on a new book that we have currently we've worked on for quite some time, and we're hoping to be out and published in January. And it's called Nationalism in Internationalism, looks at Ireland's relationship with the European Union. And I think today what I really want to talk about is really that thesis of nationalism in internationalism and what we mean by that. So what the aim will be to do is to analyse Ireland-EU relationship, but from these two contradictory ideas. And the first one is nationalism. And this has been a very long and dominant, wonderful, someone else has shared it, a long and dominant value in Irish politics. If we could just go to, yeah, that's perfect, wonderful, thank you so much. So this is to say nationalism has obviously been a very long and dominant value in Irish politics, but also we want to see that in the context of internationalism and how internationalism is represented by European integration. And the core argument really of what we're trying to do is that these contradictions of nationalism and internationalism have actually been managed with real ease in the Ireland-EU relationship. And that's why we talk about this Irish-EU relationship as a nationalism in internationalism. And I think, one of the first questions you'll ask is, well, what do you mean by nationalism and internationalism? This is a contradiction in terms. They're two concepts that perhaps shouldn't really coexist. But actually what we see is that they coexist very, very nicely. They coexist very, very well. And actually they've been quite key in the development of Ireland's relationship with the European Union. And we use this lens of nationalism in internationalism to evaluate future challenges that will face Ireland's membership of the European Union over the next 50 years and beyond. But I think one of the main points that we really try and tease out of this is that both nationalism and internationalism are not in opposition to each other. They actually work together in order to benefit that Ireland-EU relationship. And finally, then I'm going to present a vision for Europe and what is next in the course of that Ireland-EU relationship. So if we go on to the next slide then, and we look at the nationalism in internationalism and this unlikely mixture, what we would see is that the traditional interpretation of the relationship between nationalism and internationalism is a real tension between two ideas. So on the one hand, you have that kind of traditional sense of nationalism, and on the other side, you have European integration. But what European integration has done is that it's been a response to the perceived failings of nationalism. But what integration has not done, it has not supplanted nationalism. And what European integration has actually done is that it has helped turn nationalism in a particular way. So nationalism now is a lot more, it's less competitive, it's a lot less isolationist, and it's a lot less ethnic focused. And what we see is that the whole kind of thesis and turn of nationalism is a lot more cooperative, it's inclusive, and it's civic spirited. And what we have seen throughout that Ireland-EU relationship is an accommodation between European integration and nationalism rather than a permanent antagonism. So kind of a rescue of the nation state, as Millward would say. And this kind of mutual adaptation which has taken place and has also allowed kind of learning to take place as well. So how has Ireland adapted to international organizations, for example, and the international organization of the European Union more broadly, but also internationalism, and how it's accommodated that deep and very genuine emotional, but also societal and political attachment to nationalism as well. And Ireland's relationship with the European Union has often been described, if we just go on to the next slide, thank you, has often been described as an island behind an island. And really what this phase suggests is that it is both kind of protection and isolation. And what we have seen over the course of 50 years of membership is this a very gradual and partial engagement with European cooperation from, say, the 1940s to the 50s that has allowed Ireland to emerge. And what we have seen then is that when Ireland joined in the then European community in 1973, it was a really poor member state, but its position improved substantially over the following years. And what has happened then is that puts the emphasis on the economic dimension of membership, which has obviously undoubtedly been very, very central. But what we've also shown through this kind of nationalism and internationalism phase is that the political, social, and cultural elements that have been associated with membership have also really contributed to the Ireland-EU relationship more broadly. So we kind of talk about three phases of Irish membership. And the first period we talk about is economic adjustment. So in particular, the agricultural sector gained huge advantages almost immediately, but others, industries such as industry, for example, took an awful lot longer to adapt. And Ireland has really benefited from European regional social funding. The European community really served to kind of reinforce that powerful kind of sponger syndrome in Irish political culture, which at sometimes has probably been a little bit detrimental. But actually, in political terms, the Irish position has been one of excuse me, trying to be very positive and supportive about participation in the European community. And this has been very easy to maintain because, again, we've seen really strong public endorsements from the 1972 membership referendum, but also the 1987 A Single European Act referendum as well. And I think what this does is that it reflects the significant social but also societal changes that have taken place. And we can also kind of look at things like women's movements, in particular, equality legislation, all of these things that happened at a European level that really pushed Ireland on, not just economically, but in those kind of, say, other phases. The second phase I think we then talk about is catching up and going ahead. And really from the mid-1990s, what we've seen is that the Irish economy grew at an astonishing rate, creating that new era where national interests tended to be calculated in very financial terms. Now, on the one hand, some people focus on the EU as kind of a creator of the Celtic Tiger, providing kind of a significant market for Irish products and financial support for infrastructure and educational expansion. But I think it's very important to say that there was an awful lot more than just globalization going on here, Europeanization going on here, globalization was just as important. And you're really kind of starting to concentrate on Ireland's openness to investment, but also those low rates of corporation tax to really kind of trigger for growth as well. And in this period as well, there's a political argument that the EU was holding Ireland back. And if you cast your mind back to that Boston versus Berlin debate, that whole phrase, Boston versus Berlin, was not about rejecting the European Union. It was about wanting Ireland to really try to steer integration towards a more liberal, market-focused direction in order to minimize those social and environmental protections. But at the same time, what we saw during that time was very serious problems in growth in inequality, but also social discord, as Ireland and both the EU focused on those global markets. And finally, then I think when you think about Ireland EU membership, we talk the kind of third phase is characterized by a series of crises. And really, this started in 2008. You know, with the height of the financial crisis, we know Ireland was particularly exposed. We had the bailout from the EU and the IMF and all of that. But also the EU was seen in some quarters as rescuing Ireland from its own economic mismanagement. And as the economy was recovering, a further significant economic crisis has occurred in the UK, with the UK voting to leave the EU and subsequently Brexit. And I think it's really also during this phase that what we have seen is that a series of other crises, which have been a little bit more distant from an Irish perspective, but notably kind of in relation to migration, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the tensions and spreading in the eastern neighborhood. And these three phases we can identify as three interrelated contexts. What we say is that the primary focus has been European integration. However, it's very clear that this is embedded in a wider international context of globalization. And we can detect almost a kind of a transnational dimension of Ireland's growing international linkages, and one really that brings in a social and cultural aspect. And I suppose really it's kind of, how do you square the circle? How do these aspects of internationalism, so integration, globalization, transnationalism, fit together? And we actually argue that it's the relative importance of each dimension varies over time. It's not fixed, it's malleable, it changes, and it also changes in relation to the group that is involved. So you're talking about a different set of actors at different times. And these actors and drivers of change are moving towards a more internationalized state. So leading the way, we've obviously seen government actors, certainly in the initial phases of the reorientation of Irish policy, and they still continue to remain significant leaders of policy in this area. However, I think it's really important as well to talk about the economic sector and how that has played a really growing role, both also in kind of the European dimension, but also a globalist dimension. And also the role of civil society actors as well. And again, by nature, these are very heterogeneous, but we suggest that the kind of the social changes, so things like tourism, things like television, new media, have also really grown and developed the internationalism within Ireland. But there are many future challenges moving forward. And if we go on to the next slide, I just want to talk about a couple of these. The first one is public opinion. I could talk about public opinion at length. I'm not going to. I'm going to try and keep it as short and sweet as I possibly can. The main thing I think we need to talk about and highlight when we're talking about public opinion is that support for the European Union in Ireland remains consistently strong. But there is a knowledge deficit that remains, and robust engagement with civil society is very much needed in order to ensure that the Irish public is very well informed about the role of the European Union. That positive support for the EU and Ireland cannot be taken for granted. I think what we've seen even in the last session, when you look at policy areas like climate change, like enlargement, like asylum, like terrorism, we need to be having really strategic and important conversations on these and informative conversations to bring civil society in, to really ensure that people are well informed, and it's not just this passive support for the European Union going forward. Tied in with that as well, I think, is Brexit. You know, you cannot not talk about Brexit in this context. Ireland's economic relations have become greatly internationalized over the past 50 years, but relations with our neighbour, the UK, Great Britain, remain exceptionally important. And the more the EU and the UK diverge over time, the harder it's going to be to limit that impact of the trade between Northern Ireland and Great Britain and all that comes with that. We know, because of the way the border operates and the functioning of power sharing in Northern Ireland, that both the EU and the UK will be likely locked in kind of this permanent negotiation around technical elements of customs checks, of regulatory equivalence, and so on. And I think this is the unavoidable reality of the geography of Ireland. Okay, that that it's an ever evolving, but it's also a never ending Brexit either. I also think, in relation to Brexit, is that the EU offered extraordinary support for Irish interests throughout negotiations in the lead up to the withdrawal agreement. And while this kind of illustrates a very mutual nature of the Irish-EU relationship, it also raises the question whether there might be an expectation of quid pro quo in the future on key and kind of specific policy areas where maybe Ireland has been an outlier. And I think one area here is an area of taxation and tax policy. We know that this policy has been strongly associated with sovereignty. We know that Ireland has used its corporation tax rules as kind of a key component of economic policy to attract FDI. Ireland's tax policy regime has been repeatedly met with disapproval by the EU on several occasions, and Ireland has been threatened with sanctions. Now, this is also part of the policy area that is becoming less narrowly an EU issue, and there's a kind of a growing international push to find ways to limit the extent corporations can kind of tax dodge. So we know 2021, Ireland signed up to the OECD Pillar 2 rules. This was a real landmark reform in the international tax system, which will see kind of the MNCs subject to that minimum rate of tax of 15% from 2023. This is one of the biggest changes to the Irish tax system in almost 20 years. Yet, okay, and while that's kind of progress and it might stave things off for a while, there are concerns for Ireland that tax reforms could go further. France and Germany are advocating an agreed minimum tax rate, which would be higher than the current one. And I think this is kind of the aim to achieve closer economic integration by limiting tax competition across the EU. But I think a small caveat here is that as long as unanimity is maintained for tax policy changes across the EU, tax policy will remain a real outlier in that sovereign element of policy, despite kind of European integration. The other challenge I think that Ireland and the EU is going to face over the course of the next few years is on the issue of security, defence, and foreign policy. We know that Ireland is very much an outlier in this area as well. It's also an area that's very, very sensitive to the perspective of nationalism, because neutrality has often been interpreted as a marker of an independent foreign policy. So every development of EU foreign policy has been contested in Ireland. In all Irish referendums on major EU treaty change, the allegation that there's going to be a European army has been a really potent weapon for the no campaigners and a near toxic issue for yes campaigners. And that has really led to EU treaty protocols and formal EU Council decisions defining the parameters of Irish engagement on European defence and cooperation. Common foreign security policy is also an area where Irish governments are less strongly committed to preserving traditional policy. The invasion and Ukraine by Russia has really tested EU military defence and security, even for neutral states. So, you know, you've had some countries like Finland and Sweden who've applied to join NATO, and Austria, that only now leaves Austria and Malta as the only official neutral states in the EU. And I do question where Ireland places itself within all of this moving forward. The humanitarian disaster that the Ukraine war has has really given a substantial push to the EU as well. We know Ireland has allowed Ukrainians to enter Ireland without checks or visas and have access to benefits and healthcare, which is fantastic. But also, Ireland's response in relation to the Ukrainian refugees was very strongly humanitarian, and really contrasts, I think, as well from earlier refugee challenges from, say, 2015. And are we finally seeing a sea change in kind of refugee and migration policy at the EU level, but also at the Irish level as well? I also think the Ukrainian crisis highlights the need to pay attention to non-traditional security threats. When we talk about security, what are we actually talking about? We're not just talking about kind of the hard security anymore. We're talking about cyber security threats as well. Ireland has experienced firsthand how devastating it can be. We are still seeing the fallout of kind of the cyber attack on the HSE back in 2021. So there's a lot going on, I think, that when we talk about security, what do we actually mean by security and how do we move forward with it? Health then is the final policy area and future challenge I want to talk about. We do live perhaps, and I say this in kind of very tentative words, but a kind of a post-COVID world. We're not completely gone with it, but we do live in a more post-COVID world. But I think the ability of the EU to respond thoroughly and effectively at that time was very kind of limiting for the EU, for EU member states. But it also showed that the EU's role in health policy is very restricted. And it's primarily one which supports national health policies and coordinates where necessary. That's why there was a constrained response to COVID-19. It's also really important to remember that the EU is not a state in this area and does not have full executive powers in health policy. Do we want to see more coordination of this? Do we want to see kind of more health policy to be an EU competence? That would require EU treaty change. Is that something that there is an appetite for? In a recent European Movement Red C poll, when the question was asked whether Ireland and other EU member states should give the EU more control over health policy, only 35% of people agreed. So where are we moving towards in terms of this and kind of a future challenge? Finally, then, and I say this very, very quickly, a kind of a vision for Europe, and my very last slide is that Brexit has brought the nationalism and internationalism thesis into the public domain. And the need for a self-critical reprisal of the island of Ireland post-Brexit is now there. I think also the kind of self-reflection in Ireland on the Irish narrative history of nationalism, of Irishness, of unionism, of Britishness is long overdue. And it's often a very loaded, kind of often tragic history under our British rule that has led to, I think, a tendency for many to have a preoccupation with distant history and a limitation in objective historical analysis. And I think Brexit combined with this, with Irish liberalisation and the growth in confidence of Ireland as a nation state, has culminated in when we believe the first modern Irish generation that is unselfconsciously patriotic, embraces cultural nationalism, but is also non-sectarian. And as a consequence, this strengthens nationalism and in internationalism, because again, we see a gradual shift away from more traditional views, which emphasize territory and sovereignty, to a more revised approach that focuses more on social economic development. And actually, Brexit has allowed a reinterpretation of Irish nationalism, and I actually would argue has strengthened it. And when you examine the nationalism and international thesis during this period, it's evident that European integration has not supplanted nationalism. What it has done is that it's become, and it's helped turn nationalism in a particular way, making it less competitive, isolationist, ethnic focused, and a lot more cooperative and inclusive. And I think for me, that will be the focus of Ireland-EU relations for the next 50 years moving on. I will leave it there and I will take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kathryn. That was very informative and very interesting. Thank you. Now I'll hand over to Alex and then later to Ian, just mindful that we have to kind of finish 4:45 sharp. So if you could try and stay within the 15 minutes. Thank you.
Grant, thanks very much. Apologies, I just had to evict a cat there. I hope everyone can hear me.
Perfect.
Wonderful, and I should do my best to be on time, so I've got a little stopwatch, so don't worry. Grant, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation and for Dr. Simpson for her presentation. I have to say I agree with a lot of it, and there's a good bit of overlap, so that'll hopefully cut down on my timing as well for a little bit. I'm going to focus on Ireland's place in a post-Brexit EU, which is the kind of title I went for. And I'm going to look at something that I found particularly interesting and I think gives a bit of an indication of where maybe Ireland's place in a post-EU or UK-less Europe is, which is the new Hanseatic League. And I'll preface this conversation, the discussion, to just say I'm not an expert on the UK, so I'll defer to my fellow panelists there. And my opinions are my own, so they're not those of the IIA, just to say as I'm not an independent academic. I think, as we know, EU membership for the smaller member states has brought significant advantages, especially as Kathryn's put out, economic prosperity with the single market, personal development with free movement, diplomatic heft, and political support. And while nominally everyone is equal in terms of the member states, some are more equal than others, and those smaller states tend to be less well-resourced and more vulnerable than the bigger ones. And as a result, they're more reliant on ensuring good relationships and good with their neighbours, and on developing a sufficient degree of shelter or protection in the event of inclement political or economic conditions. And it's this word shelter that I think is quite interesting, and which I'm going to kind of flow back through. There's a good book by a guy called Thorhallsson in Iceland. And there's a phrase President Higgins used at his 2014 address at Windsor, ar scá chéile a Diarmuid, when talking about the Anglo-Irish relationship, and this idea that we live in the shadow of each other. And while shadow, scá, meaning shadow here, has both this negative connotation of being overcast or overpowered by something larger or more menacing, it also means to be protected, to stand behind the protection of someone. Again, as President Higgins so eloquently put it. And I think that journey of independence, since Ireland's independence, has eventually been one of dealing with the scá, the shadow cast by others, both protective and potentially menacing. And EU membership was a means to become less reliant and politically vulnerable vis-a-vis the UK and to come out of their shadow. And then once in the EU, Ireland could actually benefit from the protection that the UK offered from a like-minded London in terms of policy alignment and policy preferences. And now that the UK is gone, Ireland needs to find new allies and new friends in order to adapt to a new political reality and balance of power, hence the emergence and eventual submergence of the new Hanseatic League. And I think it's interesting to say that, yeah, I think this gives us an idea of where Ireland might be heading or its kind of interests, where its interests might lie in a post-Brexit EU. And the first time, I think, about nearly 1,000 years that Ireland and Britain aren't in some form of union with each other, the case of Northern Ireland perhaps being accepted. So a tiny bit of history, of course, but I think everyone's familiar with it, with this idea that the initial years of independence up until about 73 or so, and even afterwards, Ireland's economic and political fortunes were intertwined with those of Britain's. The punt was pegged to the pound. 3/4 of exports, mostly agricultural, went to the Irish Sea to feed Britain. And London was the primus inter pares of diplomatic relations for the Free State, well ahead of Washington, or, as I learned recently, a distant third, the Vatican. And this meant that Ireland's attempts to forge a more sovereign foreign policy were effectively circumscribed, and Ireland was bound to a degree to follow the UK and then the UK's own path into the EEC, or to withdraw when the UK was rebuffed. And we can see this asymmetry in relations with the Anglo-Irish Free Trade Agreement in '65, which on the whole benefited Britain much more than Ireland, who retained tariffs while Ireland got rid of those. But to paraphrase Michael Collins, this was the freedom to achieve economic freedom, and I think marked one of those first steps of emerging out of the shadow of the UK in terms of preparing for a more competitive, less protectionist, less autarkic economy that could enter the common market and be prepared for it. And then we also see, as John O'Brien put it quite nicely, this idea of once in the European Union, Brussels was this sort of shared space where Ireland and the UK sat together as equals around a European table rather than as former colonizer, former colonized, and where officials and politicians could get to know each other and also escape from the all-encompassing, all-consuming issue of Northern Ireland. And even though there were divergences in their fundamental philosophies, UK skepticism over an ever closer union versus more positive views from a small member state like Ireland, and tensions over Northern Ireland especially, Ireland and the UK were quite close in the Council of Ministers. If you look at the voting records and at the shared policy approaches, on things like laissez-faire, economics, taxation, as Kathryn's put it, trade, competition policy. Exception, of course, being CAP, but there's always an exception to the rule. And Ireland not only benefited from these policy preferences and from these alignments, but also the interpersonal connections, linguistic, cultural, historical, commercial, which reinforced this bilateral relationship. And essentially meant that Ireland had a very strong partner in one of the big, powerful, influential member states, and was able to benefit from the UK's resources as a result. And while I'll not delve into the sorrowful mysteries of Brexit, I'll note that the seeds of this kind of policy divergence have been long in the tooth. And even before going back to the Conservative coalition coming in 2010, you could see that the UK really became an outlier in the council. And they lost nearly 1 in 8 votes between 2009 and 2015. So we're consistently on the outs. And they began with the Brexit vote. Then Britain began to wind down its operation, reducing the size of the Perm Rep, renaming it. And this effective downgrade has presented the challenge for Ireland that I think now is really interesting. They've lost their main ally, they've lost access to the resources, to the diplomatic heft, to the influence, to the just expertise and the connections. And Ireland's also a unique case now left in the EU, sole liberal market economy, very distinct from the continental social welfare model, distinct economic or administrative traditions, economy based on FDI, interest not broadly shared with other member states in the Union, and now a bit exposed in a way with the loss of the cover that was provided by the UK. So this meant Ireland had to go out and seek new friends. And while the economists might have called us a diplomatic superpower, and I think with Brexit that's been proven to be fairly accurate, I think Ireland's unique and quite interesting if you look at the ECFR's coalition builder, which, as well as Dr. Cooper's really interesting work on groups within the EU. Ireland hasn't really been part of anything like Benelux or the Visegrad or the Nordics. And it doesn't mean we're flexible and we can move from policy area to policy area. It does mean you're isolated in terms of who phones whom, who sits in the room beforehand, who has those informal, constant connections with one another, who has the lunches and the coffees and the like. And those are important, those little informal networking, that corridor politics. And it really highlights that Ireland's on the geographic and the diplomatic periphery. It's an island behind an island, and that island is a bit of a block from the rest. So with the loss of the UK, Ireland had to find new allies. And I mean, the departure of the UK was a seismic event for the whole union, especially those smaller trade-oriented open economies, wary of interventionist economic talk. Strategic autonomy saw it as protectionism. And with March 2018, you had the new Hanseatic League, or the Hansas, the Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Ireland. And although it doesn't quite map onto the actual historical medieval trading alliance, the nod does reflect the ambitions with that focus on trade and economic and monetary cooperation to avoiding deeper integration while focusing on competitiveness and reform. And a key concern, which I think reflected Ireland's material interests of what the future shape of the union should be that those member states with opt-outs from the Eurozone, Justice, Home Affairs, Schengen, etc., or those who feared they might be outvoted if the veto was removed or left worse off at the margins of a multi-speed Europe, shouldn't be negatively impacted as a result. And also, I think there was a concept that the League was a way to build influence and to have a bit of a stay in the traditional balance of power within the union. And if you look at the weighting in terms of the council and how the votes shook out, the new Hanseatic League was approximately the same size as the UK in terms of population of the EU and consequent voting share. So I think there's an interesting point there as well. So the League as a way for Ireland's reorientation within a post-Brexit EU, I think is tied into 2 points. One is, first of all, of course, Brexit and the loss of this liberal lion for a more competitive, more open market, breaking down trade barriers, smaller EU budget, wary of growing interventionism. But the other was the antithesis with the election of Macron in 2017 in May, who, a bit more conservative perhaps than his predecessor, was much more openly in favor of more integration, of a more federalist EU vision, common taxation or tax harmonization, common defense efforts, common Eurozone budget, as outlined in his Sorbonne speech in 2017. And this, coupled with a weakened Merkel in Germany and the loss of the UK, presented this considerable challenge for these defenders of more conservative, laissez-faire, open, free and fair trade economies like Ireland. For some, of course, the concern was, like Ireland especially, was in filling that gap left by Britain and keeping that tradition alive. But for others in this grouping, like the Baltics, the concern was more over France and its perceived softness towards Moscow or desire to reset EU relations. So the League wasn't homogenous in that sense. And I wouldn't say that it ever was. But I think it's also important to say that the League was more future oriented in what the possible shape of the Union could be going forward, and rather distinct from the debates about Brexit. And on the case of Northern Ireland and the peace process in Northern Ireland. And what fed into it, and I think is an interesting angle about how Ireland consciously tried to model itself within the Union, is this narrative on Ireland of dispelling stereotypes, as the DFA strategy on Hiberno-German relations put it, and on challenging associations of Ireland as being an economically responsible member of the pigs from the Eurozone crisis, and of portraying Ireland more as being a geographically, culturally northern member state, as a fiscally responsible member state. So I think there's an interesting angle there of trying to reorientate Ireland's place within the geographical imagination of Europe. For the sake of brevity, I'll avoid going into too much on the reign or the rise, arguable reign and fall of the League, but I think that key demise was COVID. I mean, so we have this growing tension between the North and the South, of the North being seen as intractable and not willing to cooperate or even show solidarity, which I think was a very important point, of being dogmatic or being unyielding. And this risked undermining goodwill for member states, especially for Ireland, which was so reliant on goodwill from all the other member states over the case of Northern Ireland. And despite receiving several wins that were beneficial for Ireland's sort of naked economic interests, especially on digital taxation, these diplomatic costs were starting to strain within the League, within the organization, and with pulling it down. And despite Brexit actually happening by 2020, formally leaving, the COVID-19 pandemic has since overshadowed all the other agenda points and really began to dominate what the future of the EU was starting to look like. And that failure to agree on the MFF for the 2021-2027 period at the February 2020 European Council meeting really demonstrated this. Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, I think famous for coming in with a thick biography of Chopin and just saying, our position's known, I don't see what there is to negotiate, and just not willing to engage in any way. And this really underscored the group's collective identity as being callous or immoral or even cruel in the eyes of those who were suffering the most, like Italy. And I think you saw that reflected in the media portrayals of the League. And this sort of increasingly negative association, combined with the question over the rising cost of how are we going to deal with COVID, eventually broke the League in two. And on one hand, you had Ireland, joined by Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, all in similar economic positions, who basically backed a French position and went for the support of a mutualized debt issuance ahead of the European Council video conference in March 2020. And on the other hand, you had the frugal four, the remainders plus Austria, who were consistently hardline and opposed any efforts to go further. And this effectively ended the League and Ireland's first attempt at forging a new set of allies. And I know I've got about a minute left, so I'll be quite brief here. But I do think it's interesting that Ireland, at the one point, was considered to become a net recipient to a net contributor in terms of the EU budget. So it actually pay in more than it got out for the first time. But this became a little bit less clear with Brexit and COVID. So maybe there's still a naked economic interest there in terms of flipping allegiances. But on the other hand, this question of being a responsible member of the European Union who shows solidarity with others, I think really fits into this question of how do you present yourself in terms of your narrative in Europe? And how do you present this concept of shelter by supporting or aligning yourselves with member states who are maybe on the up or the down? So I think there's an interesting point there in terms of just balancing power and how a small state navigates that. And I'll be very brief on the future challenges because I think maybe we don't have enough time. And Kathryn, I think, pointed out all of them: defense, health, security. I think one that's maybe worth discussing is the question about the economic changes. There's talk of state aid coming back. We have this idea of a European sovereignty fund. Important projects of common European interest are coming back and receiving increased support. The Stability and Growth Pact rules have been suspended to the point where I don't think they're going to come back. And in this case, is Ireland's commitment to a laissez-faire economic model of free trade and FDI perhaps hopelessly naive, or is it still fit for purpose if we're going to have an increasingly protectionist global trade and economic model? And how could Ireland match the resources brought to bear by France and Germany? So there's a debate to be had there about what the future economic shape of Ireland is within the Union and where our place is going to be in that. So I think I'll end on just saying, like, when geopolitical and economic facts change, like Brexit, so do your opinions. And I think these will be the thing that changes us in the future. And I am on 14:56, so I think I'm just in time, and sorry.
Perfect. No, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. And now I'll hand over for the final word to Ian.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm the finish line is in sight, everyone, and I'm dead last. But hopefully you still have a little bit of patience for what I have to say. And I'm just sharing my screen. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I am just going to talk about Brexit and Ireland and the UK after Brexit, their relations, but I'm going to talk about it in the context of a couple of teaching tools that we developed here at the Brexit Institute. And it was part of the Jean Monnet Network Bridge, which ran from 2019 to 2022. So it's just finished. And within we had a mandate to disseminate expert knowledge about the European Union and Brexit to the general public. So of course it was an academic network, and a lot of our work was with one another and with various European institutions and stakeholders. But we also wanted to be able to reach the general public with actual expert knowledge. So and we did it through the creation of two tools. One was a MOOC, a massive open online course, and the other was an interactive map. So I'm just going to talk about these two briefly. So the MOOC was called the European Union Crisis and Recovery, and it was we put it together on the Future Learn platform with the help of the National Institute of Digital Learning, which is at DCU. And so we partnered with them in putting together this massive open online course, and it was very much driven by research. It was driven by our research focus. And so the focus of the Bridge Network is obviously it was about Brexit, but it was also about differentiated governance in the EU and about the kind of the decade of crises that we've just come through. So in this course, originally we were going to do it in towards the end of the 3-year project, but then the pandemic hit, and so we're all stuck at home. So we realized, well, we might as well just make the MOOC first. And so we did it. We created this MOOC in 2022. And so in addition to the crises that were the original focus of our network, those were Brexit, the Euro crisis, the rule of law crisis, and migration. We also added a section on the COVID-19 crisis and a little bit about the future of Europe, the run up to the conference on the future of Europe, to add perhaps a little bit of hope at the end after this long litany of crises. And I was the lead educator on this course, and so in putting this together, I learned a lot about this style of teaching and learning. That it's not based on big long lectures. It's based on a whole bunch of very small bite-sized pieces of knowledge that you are imparting to the learners as they go along. You keep changing these different kinds of elements to keep the learners interested. And so you'll have a short video, and then you'll have maybe an audio excerpt, then some kind of an exercise like a timeline, an article, something to read, and then interspersed with interactive elements like a poll or a quiz or a discussion. And if you go to discussion section, then there, as if you're the lead educator when the course was actually running live. It ran live in the last 4 months of 2022, and I was interacting with students on a daily basis, and they would make comments and ask questions, and I would be interacting with them. It was really very stimulating process. Now that the course is no longer live, but it's still up on the Future Learn platform, and it's completely free for anybody who is interested. It's slightly out of date now, as you can imagine, especially with some of the Brexit things that have happened since 2020. But in any case, it was a fascinating project and quite successful. We got more than 3,000 registered learners on that course. Now, so that's one thing I wanted to talk about, and then the other was our interactive map. And again, this was driven by research in the sense that we wanted to demonstrate differentiation in the EU, both inside and outside. And a lot of it has to do with Brexit, because of course, if you think about internal differentiation, well, the UK is no longer an EU member state. And so forms of differentiation that we're interested in, I mean, there are all kinds of different forms of differentiation. We focused on those that are related to the subject matter of our network. If you look at, so we looked at first economic differentiation, so with relation to economic and monetary union, in thinking about justice and the rule of law, different forms of differentiation in terms of whether or not certain states have an opt-out of certain justice and home affairs measures, like Ireland, whether countries have joined the European Public Prosecutor's Office, and Ireland is, of course, one of the states that has not joined the EPO. We also point to the 2 states that are subject to Article 7 proceedings for rule of law violations. That, of course, is Hungary and Poland, and the cooperation and verification mechanism for Romania and Bulgaria. Now, in looking at, there are certain other policies that we looked at, enhanced cooperation policies, another form of differentiation. And then finally, which Alex so kindly mentioned, we also, again, this is driven by some of our research, a paper that I wrote with Federico Fabbrini. We looked at different regional groups within the European Union. There are 15 of them. And of course, as Alex mentioned, one of them is the New Hanseatic League, which includes Ireland. And so you can see there the 8 states of the New Hanseatic League. And also on this map, if you click on a member state, it brings up some facts about each member state. So the date that it joined the EU, some basic statistics like population, when it joined the Eurozone, and whether it has certain kind of opt-outs from different EU policies, and whether it's part of different regional groups. And if you want to dig deeper, you can click on the country report, and that'll actually bring you to a country report, which will give you a longer narrative explanation of how that particular state was affected by the different crises that affected the EU. And John very kindly helped out on the Ireland report, along with Barry Colfer. And it gives you, so it tells you how a particular member state was affected by the various crises that have hit the EU over the years. Obviously, and Ireland is particularly affected by Brexit. It also tells you how whether the state in question is subject to different forms of differentiation, and how it was affected by COVID-19, the Recovery Fund, and what, if anything, it's done about the Conference on the Future of Europe. Then going back briefly, talk about external differentiation, the relationship between the EU and the other states in Europe. And we counted that there were 23 states altogether in Europe, including microstates. And again, we were trying to show this is research driven, in particular thinking about Brexit, trying to compare the UK's relationship post-Brexit to the EU to other states, other non-EU states in Europe. So, for example, economic integration. Well, there are a number of states in the EU that are part of the single market, and in that we include not only the EEA EFTA states, but also states like Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, which have a deep and comprehensive free trade area with the United Kingdom, sorry, with the EU, which brings them into close association with the single market. Also, so the UK is out of the single market, it's out of the customs union, doesn't use the euro, where unlike countries like Montenegro and Kosovo, which actually use the euro as their currency. And so all of these are ways of illustrating the kind of different kind of relationships that the UK has, that the EU has with neighbors, including the UK. Migration cooperation is another one, and political association with non-EU states, such as through the stabilization and association agreements with the Balkan states, Eastern Partnership countries, and the Council of Europe. And we had to go back and make a change to the map to reflect the fact that Russia was expelled from the Council of Europe earlier this year. And so that's just give you, and all of this is available on the website of the Bridge Network. And just the question about what comes next for us, our next project is the Rebuild project. And if I refresh this, and you'll see our little crane swinging, which we're very pleased about. There it goes. So we will be using the lessons we learned from the Bridge Network. We're going to go into the Rebuild project, which is about next generation EU. And one of the deliverables for the Rebuild project is going to be a MOOC, and we're quite excited about that. And so so stay tuned for that's what's going to come next for the coming out of as an output of the DCU Brexit Institute.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think I've seen the chats that were already going on. So a number of questions were already asked and answered. And if any of you want to respond to anything that you haven't been able to answer, maybe pick out the one thing that perhaps you didn't get the chance to write in the chat, and maybe take about one to 2 minutes each maximum, so that we can then conclude. Maybe Kathryn, do you want to start, and then we go to Alexander and then to Ian?
Yeah, I'm going to be very, very brief because I have spoken long enough today. And I think I'll just touch upon the whole kind of thesis and concept of nationalism and internationalism, and whether it can be kind of adapted to other member states, which we believe that it can. We don't think it's exclusive to Ireland. So it's something that is kind of in the pipeline for future projects about whether we can look at other EU member states in this context. And whether we can help, whether Ireland can help its near neighbour to recover, so to speak. I think it can. I think it can be there just as a positive listening voice and continue its positivity to have a good relationship with its near neighbour. And hopefully the UK will reciprocate in the same light. But I'll close mine there. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe Alexander?
Sure, I'll be very brief as well. I mean, one thing I've noticed in just covering the EU for the Institute is there seems to be an increasing interest in this idea of regions or groupings or alliances of some description, and you see it reflected in policy, like these important projects of common European interest, which is state aid by another name. So I think the fact that Ireland's sort of geographically isolated is an interesting factor in that, and similar to other islands like Malta and to Cyprus as well. So it's just an interesting trend I've noticed, and I'm just personally interested in these alliances anyway, as a former recovering geographer. And the last one would be, I'd agree with Kathryn on the links between Ireland and the UK, and I think that might be an interesting angle for Ireland to be that sort of explainer of the UK, given the context connections, as well as the possible institutional connections that can be put forward through the East-West strand of the Good Friday Agreement, thinking the British-Irish Governmental Council. No one else in the EU is going to have that level of organised, structured, regular meetings of civil servants and politicians that Ireland could potentially have.
Thank you. Perfect. And maybe Ian?
Well, I don't have anything to add except just to say thank you to the organizers of this conference. It's been really fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, on that note, then it's up to me to thank you all very much as well. Thank you to all the speakers, not just the speakers in the last panel, but in fact, the speakers of the entire workshop, conference and launch event. It's been fantastic. I think over the last 2 days, I've learned so much. I'm really excited about all the things that we've discussed, and we've nicely recorded it, so technical issues overcome, and we'll manage to kind of use some of that, and then perhaps you'll be able to then rewatch some of our discussions that we've had. I thank all of the audience for having participated so much, for having asked really pertinent questions, for having contributed to our debate and everything. And of course, I thank the European Commission. I think that I need to say that we're extremely grateful for having been given this opportunity of the grant. Thank you very much for this co-funding that has enabled us to really have these wonderful discussions. And of course, I'm very, very grateful for everyone who's contributed. I don't know, Sarah, do you want to say last few words as well?
I just wanted to thank everyone for coming. We know it's a very busy time of the year, so thank you to the presenters and also to the audience. And also a big thank you to Federica Fazio, who's a PhD researcher at DCU and who has helped us promote the event. So thank you, Federica, as well.
Thank you, everyone. So it's been fantastic, and we're hoping to see you back very, very soon with a new event. So thank you so much, and well, enjoy Christmas fairly soon, and have a happy new year, and then see you soon in the new year. Thank you.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Thanks, Million.
Thanks.
Bye.